Four-sided polygons, generally speaking, are we don't like them generally as modelers, and there's a couple reasons why. Like if I try to double-click around this edge, I can't because, you know, this, let's say clicking parallel edges will still work because they're still parallel. There's still a simple edge connecting these. In this case, there's no kind of mesh on the opposite side of this edge that allows me to quickly select through. So there's a couple of ways to deal with this. One way is to take something like this. One of my cheats is to simply go in and do like an offset. So offset that face in. And if you want, I mean, that's great because now I can quickly go through this, right? Because this is good edge flow. Edge flow meaning that I've got simple lines that cross each other and form a quad-like or grid-like pattern, right? So four-sided polys, simple mesh selection. And then, you know, maybe if I want to keep that border, I might take this again and extrude it one more time with an offset. And then simply shift right click and merge to center. So yes, it leaves triangles, but that allows me to still quickly and cleanly go around and select those areas. Another way which I have used in the past instead of doing this is to actually, you know, maybe delete a polygon and to grab a comparable number of edges and do a bridge across. Sorry, let's try to bridge that again. Oh boy. Okay, let me try this one more time. Let's undo. There we go. Go to face mode and delete that. There. And I'll try to bridge. This time I'll make sure any kind of like linear setting, curve setting is off. I should actually just probably reset this. Reset the divisions to 0. And then you're going to try to match as best you can. Like this is difficult because there's a curvature here, but so I'll have to get as close as I can. I'm assuming that's the right number of edges. Really picky for this, you need the exact same number of edges. So if I grab 5 edges over here to bridge, or 6 let's say, I think that's 6. I'll try to grab 6 down here and do another bridge. Not great. So you could always leave the face too, right? Like one of the things is to leave the face, but then you're still manually kind of going through and saying, okay, let's maybe connect. I often like to use connect as opposed to the multicut tool in these situations because it gives me a clean straight edge across, and sometimes with multicut, sorry, if you're not close, if you're just near a vertex, you might click on an edge instead to connect across. So connect is like using the multicut tool, but it's super accurate. Yes, there's a question.
So you said that like extruding inwards to basically be able to like select everything cleanly. Wouldn't that just create another face that's not quad based?
Yes, it's not quad based, but like I said, I'd prefer triangles over what are called n-gons. So an n-gon is a polygon with 5 sides or more, right? So we don't want n-gons, generally speaking, because it just creates kind of havoc and chaos in the mesh. My preference is still to kind of do something like this, but it's kind of a goddamn nightmare, if you don't mind me saying that. Yeah, it's just like so painful to go through a mesh and try to do all that, right? And then to duplicate it over here. So a lot of times, you know, if you're looking at professional modelers, I'll show you a couple. There's Vitaly Bulgarov, who does like a lot of crazy mech stuff, right? If you take a look, yeah, let's go to his website. If you go to, let's say, his store, you know, you can sort of take a look at the pieces of mesh. So you do want to avoid triangles and 5-sided polygons if you're smoothing mesh to create mechanical or organic mesh, because triangles can cause weird surface issues, can cause weird pinching and dimpling when you smooth. But if you're building mechanical parts, triangles are fine because that mesh needs to go somewhere, and you still want to be able to select around it. So if you take a look, right, you know, maybe there's a boolean here, and, you know, at least to connect the mesh to make sure, you know, whatever software he's using, 3D Max or Maya, you know, isn't just automatically triangulating it. He's sort of doing it intentionally, right? So to do something like that, you can actually just go into mesh triangulate. And so all we're actually doing is forcing actual edges to appear where the software, if we go into display polys, we can see where the triangles are. Like I said in the very first class, every polygon, no matter if it's made up of 3 sides, 4 sides, or like 25 sides like this might be, is still made up of triangles. It's just that the software hides it for us but it still can prevent things like our selection, right? So my selection around here, kind of breaks down a bit. So, I do want to be able to kind of quickly move around this surface here. So to do that, sometimes the easiest thing to do is simply go into modify and, into mesh and go to triangulate. Right, so now I should be able to quickly kind of, for the most part, get around this and select. I still have a bit more selection work to do because the triangles aren't necessarily evenly placed, which is why I prefer my other technique. So let me just turn off this face triangles thing again. So again, my technique of extrude, basically doing an offset first to create a border, do a second extrusion with another offset, and then simply merge to center. Because this gives you equal spacing and it still allows you to quickly and cleanly select. So this is great in the case of non-smoothing mesh. Mesh you don't intend to, right, to hit 3 on. Because if I hit 3 on this, right, it does this kind of, it may look okay at some point, but it can do some really awful things along your edges. Smooth mesh generally prefers quads for the most part. So that's kind of, a different approach. So you want to plan things out. If you plan to kind of smooth something out to create something that you couldn't do otherwise with very basic like beveling and all that, then you want to stick with more quad-based mesh. If you're just going to do hard surface modeling and just kind of boolean everything, sorry, not boolean, but bevel, right? This I can quickly and cleanly go through and just add segments to round that out. In this case, I can now, for the most part, quickly grab this face. If I don't have the camera select option on, I may have to deselect that side. And now I can simply go in and do an extrusion here. And then also grab maybe this edge and maybe even this edge and do a smaller bevel here, let's say. So I can just kind of round those edges out, or at least give them something reflective to sort of bounce some highlights from, right? So get this really nice appearance in this object. The other thing is, a lot of people ask in terms of modeling, when do I use a higher poly mesh? So some objects I notice people they just had the default sort of 20 edges, or maybe they only had 8 edges, which is fine if the object looks that way. But if you're planning to make this a clock, then you have to either smooth it or replace the object with a much higher edge cylinder. So if you're smoothing, I mentioned this before, I usually work in 8 divisions of 8 because it does give you better results when smoothed. 8, 16, 24, 32. I usually work with 8 because I work in mesh as simply as possible when it comes to hard surface objects, at least at the beginning. So let me delete these bottom faces. If I hit 3, right, this sort of smooths out. And to sharpen it, if we're doing smoothing based modeling, what you actually need to do is, it's called adding support edges. So there's 2 ways to basically do this. You can use a multi-cut tool, cut in an edge there. And in this case, because it's a flat surface and it's triangulated at the top, I'll have to do an offset extrusion basically. So a support edge basically means I have the original edge and I've got a supporting edge on one side and a supporting edge on the other. So that sharpens that in a smoothing process, right? So it's the same thing if I take this out here and let me just do a shift scale. You see it kind of rounds out because this is so low poly. Smoothing actually kind of creates a curvature between these very distant edges. And if I often use this as a trick as well as actually doing a bevel, but having 2 segments and making it very, very tight. So a very, very small fraction. Let me just adjust this dial. So if I bring that really close, I don't want them sitting on top of each other, but I want them very close. And then when I hit 3, right, it looks like a very sharp peg coming out of a flat surface instead of having a rounded slope. That's just one sort of school of modeling. So you can approach it that way, or you can simply say, well, I'm going to take this cylinder, and again, if we look at its just pure silhouette, you see it looks very segmented, right? So you have to think about this and plan ahead a bit and say, I'm going to set this to 32. For me, I find usually 48 divisions at a minimum. It starts to look pretty smooth. Again, if it's close up, it starts to break down a bit. So 64 is usually a good number. If you're seeing something on a large scale, if you're seeing it in close-up, this looks fairly round with 64 divisions. Again, you have to be careful. So let's say you've got a lot of objects that are really tiny and repeating, make them lower divisions, right? If they're small, if they're not seen in close-up, you can make them lower divisions. If they're big or if they're seen in close-up, then you have to increase your divisions. And in this case, I'm not going to do what I did on the other object. I will actually, oops. Let's go to Multicut here. And I'll try to build roughly the same thing, but just with regular kind of bevels and extrusions here. So I'll take this, hold shift and scale out. And then what I'll do, right, is take this and to kind of give it a rounded edge, give it a very small fraction, give it a couple of segments. By the way, this is a little bit odd. You know, when you click on this little dial in the, or maybe I'll make this a larger palette, by the way, so you guys can see that. So when you click on this little dial here, right, in your bevel options, it's kind of like a snapping setting. So when I set it really low by clicking on it and it's this small setting, I can get a really nice small fraction, but it takes me forever with my mouse to move the segments. It's a bit of a goofy thing in Maya, but if I just click on that a couple times, then I can quickly increase or decrease segments. So that one I'll leave it a little looser so it's a little more soft and rounded, and this one I'm going to hit G to repeat my last command. Crank the fraction. Again, I'm going to have to dial this back down there. Give it a much smaller fraction, maybe only give it a couple of segments, let's say. Yeah, like 3 is probably fine. Okay, so they're comparable, it's just that they're using different methods. This method of this is called subdivision modeling. A lot of people refer to it as hard surface modeling, but really technically these are both hard surface, right? So I recommend that you try not to ever leave an object, especially if you're dealing with high poly modeling, never leave an object with perfectly sharp CG edges because it looks perfectly fake and CG, right? Even if you're building just a cube, at the very least you can simply go into edge mode, grab all the edges, and do a quick bevel. And if I were to do that, I'd make it super small, just a simple one segment bevel, right? And you see it's already providing a little bit of reflective highlights. When I'm doing this kind of modeling, by the way, I usually like to assign a blend. I usually like to make the blend very, very kind of dark gray, dark middle gray, and I will crank up the specular color and maybe the spec roll off so it's got really vibrant hot spots. So you can really see, right, those reflective edges. So I find that very useful. One other thing I should mention just in relation to this is that if I have complex dials, buttons, and knobs, and you want to connect this stuff to other mesh, so a lot of people think, oh, I got a boolean everything. Well, you can kind of build, let's say, an individual piece. So let me restart this. I'll quickly go in and just get the cylinder back up to, let's say, 64. Grab the bottom faces here, delete those. I'll take this edge, move it up, hold shift and scale this out, hold shift and move this up, and let's say we hold shift and scale it out again. So if you're, this is, again, it's a very high poly mesh in this area. There's a really great way to just kind of get the density down on this thing. So what I'm going to do is try to grab kind of like 90% kind of pies, like a quarter pie here. I'll deselect the inner. I'm going to go shift, merge vertices to center. So yes, there's triangles, but like I said, this is allowed in this method because I'm just doing straight up bevels on the hard edges. I'm not smoothing, so I can have triangles instead of making sure it's all quads, right? So there's an exception to every rule, and it depends on what method you're using. And I'm just using the repeat last command, right, which is G. There. Now if I want to just even these out, I will often just use the scale. Right? So now you've got kind of a little modular button, knob, whatever. By the way, you don't need to make sure everything's extruded from a single piece too. You can have a much simpler extrusion, but I use the same divisions because this looks nice and smooth and round, right? So not everything needs to be one piece. I often build things as kind of separate floating pieces and then combine them, right? So let's go do something like that. So we got this little dial thing. So what's great about this, right? By the way, there's a little thing in Maya that's kind of buried. If you double click on your move tool, and you go into, there's an option at the bottom called Smart Duplicate. You can do a shift drag on the object level, not on the sub-object or component level, and you can either make copies or instances this way. So it's kind of like hitting Control D or Duplicate Special, but instead you're just shift dragging. Now I can do a Shift D, right? Make multiple copies. So if you have a little panel with a bunch of buttons, dials, and knobs, it's so much easier to try to connect 4 corners than it is 64 vertices, right? And weld them together. So this is another kind of technique that is used a lot. Sorry, let me go to vertex mode. And so I would just kind of grab these corner verts. Let's try that again. There we go. Oh, these things are still separate. By the way, if they're instances, you may need to go to Modify, Convert Instances to Object in order to actually combine them. So that's another little note there. So combine these, then go to Vertex mode and select. You want to select over because they may be touching. There may be a little gap, right? And then we go in, right-click, Merge Vertices. You don't want to merge to center because it'll do something god-awful like that, right? You want to go Merge Verts and then make sure the threshold is high enough to snap these together. So I just, if it's working in one pair, it should be working in the rest because I did a complete copy of those. So now this is, one piece. And if I have another more complex object or mesh, I just need to make sure I have, right, the same number of connecting edges here. So let me just kind of scale this box. We'll pretend it's a little, I don't know, sort of Bluetooth speaker thing, right? So I'll simply go to Multicut on, this object. There we go. Multicut. And so I need these, there needs to be the same approximate number of edge loops for this to kind of connect into, right? So a lot of this is about kind of planning ahead a bit and making sure, let's just make sure there's nothing selected down there. All right. So plan ahead a bit and just make sure that these things will kind of sync up. So I'm just going to eyeball this. There we go. And then we'll do a little combine on this. So let's double click these edges. I'm just going to nudge this opening over a bit. Maybe extend it out. And so what I often like to do is using edge mode. I find it's a little bit quicker if we go to the modeling toolkit over here. Simply go to target weld. And if you want, this is a cleaner grid, the one that these buttons that I attached. So I'm going to just, every second edge you weld, because it will automatically weld this, because the vertices of this edge are connected to that edge, right? So that's why I find this method of target welding with edges is a little bit quicker. And yeah, sometimes target weld gets a little funky because it doesn't quite read the opposite edge. So you may need to just rotate around. So again, this is how we can go from really, really complex kind of buttons to simple surfaces, So for me, I often keep the sort of base shape simple, or I get the base shape knocked in. Then I start kind of maybe in separate little chunks, build like the buttons, the dials, the phone jacks. If there's a way to split an object, so sometimes things are split, I may say, okay, I'll take Multicut through here. By the way, Multicut averages its distance, so if I want a straight line here, I'm just going to scale this flat. So maybe there's something different on the front panel. Sometimes I may split off the mesh because it's easier to work in separate pieces than it is, as if it were one whole object. Anytime I see a seam, I may try to split the object off. So I could do an extract in this case and just do, instead of separating it to a separate object, I still want to keep it as part of the surface, but now it's actually kind of separate and floating. So I could do something different on, let's say, the front side of that piece, or, maybe I can just bolt in a power cord section or a little USB jack or something, Yeah, if you get really picky and anal, if you need that line to be straight, well, it's very simple. Just grab the whole loop, and you can scale it straight, right? And if you need to, you can nudge it in position. If you want to keep the position of those edges, well, just deselect the edges that are connected to them, scale them, and then drag them. Oops, did I? Yeah, let me just double click this again. Sorry, one sec. Deselect that, deselect that. Make sure we scale that straight and flat, and then we can slide it over so that it's pretty much in alignment. There, right? So you can straighten edges that way too. So if you need some kind of seam or cut along there, you can do that as well. Generally speaking, I wouldn't want to cut along here or split along here because these corners can be really problematic. So my preference would be to kind of cut right next to it if I needed something. So maybe I want to move this, slide this over, do a little bevel, right? And then I would take the faces here and maybe do a little extrude. So I'll do this based on a thickness. So now we got that, right? Yeah.